Effective immediately, we're voting to remove you as CEO. The words hung in the air like smoke, each syllable settling into my chest heavier than the last. I stared at the screen behind them, the one still displaying our $12.4 million valuation in crisp white numbers against the company's signature blue background. My company. 7 years of 18-hour days, missed birthdays, and payroll anxiety. All reduced to a single sentence delivered with the same clinical detachment you'd use to discuss quarterly projections. 4 hands went up around the glass table, gleaming under recessed lighting I had personally approved during the office renovation 2 years ago. Mine didn't. It stayed in my lap, fingers numb, while somewhere in the building I could hear the faint hum of servers I'd configured with my own hands in the early days. The company logo. My logo, my design, sketched on a napkin at 3 in the morning, was etched into the wall behind them, mocking me with its permanence. I'd built this place from nothing, from a rented warehouse where my breath fogged in winter and summer meant working shirtless just to stay conscious, and in under 60 seconds, I was erased from it like a typo in a draft email. My access badge failed before I reached the elevator. The turnstile blinked red, that angry little light I'd seen stop delivery drivers and interns, now stopping me. I swiped again. Red. Again. Red. Security wouldn't look me in the eye. The young guard with the close-cropped beard who I'd interviewed personally 2 years ago, who I'd approved for a raise last quarter when his daughter was born premature, suddenly found the monitor in front of him absolutely fascinating. Through the glass walls that lined the corridor, employees froze at their desks like figures in a paused video game, confusion written across their faces, some mouths slightly open, some hands hovering over keyboards mid-keystroke. Maria from accounting pressed her palm against the glass, and I saw her eyes glisten. Jason, my first engineering hire, stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the cube wall with a thud I could hear through the glass. I wasn't just losing a title, wasn't just being demoted or transitioned or any of the other gentle words they use. I was being removed like a security risk, like someone who might steal the very thing I had built with my own blistered hands, from a building where I still knew which floorboards creaked and which conference room had the best afternoon light. My name is Caleb Whitaker, and I need you to understand where I came from before you judge any of what follows. I'm from Dayton, Ohio. Not the part they put in brochures, but the part where factories closed and stayed closed, where downtown has more empty storefronts than full ones, where ambition is something other people have. No Ivy League pedigree, no wealthy relatives, no trust fund waiting in the wings, just a dad who worked double shifts at a machine shop for 30 years until his hands curled into permanent fists from the vibration of the tools, and who came home smelling of cutting oil and exhaustion. He told me exactly once, while we were sitting on the front steps watching the neighbor's dog chase fireflies. If you build something, build it so you can sleep at night. I was maybe 12, too young to understand what he meant, but I carried that sentence into every decision I ever made, every contract I signed, every person I hired. It sat in my chest like a compass needle, and on the nights when I lay awake wondering if I'd made the right call, I'd hear his voice, gravelly, tired, certain. And know that whatever else I lost, I could at least close my eyes when the day was done. I started the company in a rented warehouse on the edge of town, the kind of place where the landlord only accepted cash and the bathroom door didn't quite close. That first winter, our breath hung in the air while we packed boxes, little clouds of determination with every exhale, and we wore gloves with the fingertips cut off so we could still type. I used folding tables from a church that was upgrading their fellowship hall, $40 for 6 of them, scratched particle board and wobbly legs, and a space heater that clicked louder than it warmed, a rhythmic tick-tick-tick that became the soundtrack of those early months. When we landed our first real contract, a $12,000 order that felt like winning the lottery, I celebrated by buying the team pizza I couldn't afford. Domino's, large cheese and pepperoni, $45 that came out of my grocery budget and meant ramen for the next week. We ate standing up because we didn't have chairs yet, grease soaking through the cardboard, and everyone laughed about something. I don't remember what, and in that moment, standing in the cold with sauce on my shirt and no idea if we'd make payroll next month, I was happier than I've ever been since. That's when Thomas Brennan walked in. Late 60s, maybe early 70s, he was hard to read. With worn boots that had been resoled more than once and a quiet voice that made people lean in to hear him. His resume was thinner than everyone else's who applied for the operations job, full of gaps and roles I didn't recognize, nothing flashy or impressive on paper. The operations manager pulled me aside after the interview and told me flat out that Thomas would slow us down, that we needed someone younger, hungrier, more familiar with modern systems. I almost agreed. Almost. But something in his eyes said steady, said reliable, said I've seen things and I'm still standing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe we had enough hungry young people and not enough people who knew how to finish what they started. I hired him anyway, against advice, against logic, against every metric that said pick the other candidate. It was instinct, pure and simple, and I'd learned later that instinct is just experience wearing a different name. 3 months later, Thomas made a shipping mistake that cost us our biggest client at the time. Wrong product, wrong address, wrong everything. A cascade of errors that started with a misfiled invoice and ended with a $40,000 contract going to a competitor who'd been circling for months. The investors, all 4 of them, demanded I let him go. They used words like liability and accountability, circling the same point like sharks, and I sat there nodding because what else could I do? Cash flow was tight enough that payroll made me sweat through my shirts, tight enough that I'd started skipping lunch to save $8 a day, tight enough that this loss genuinely hurt. But instead of firing him, instead of doing the smart business thing, I asked him what was going on. Not in the meeting, not publicly, but later, after everyone else had gone home, I found him in the warehouse sitting on a stack of pallets, staring at nothing, and I sat down next to him and waited. He told me his wife had cancer. Ovarian, stage 3, discovered too late for the easy treatments. The therapies were crushing them financially, insurance only covered so much, and the experimental stuff, the things that might actually work, came with price tags that made my stomach turn. He'd been working nights at the hospital, sleeping in waiting room chairs, and days at the warehouse, running on coffee and willpower, and the mistake happened because he'd been awake for 47 hours and his brain simply stopped working. I listened to all of it, sitting on those pallets in the dim warehouse light, and when he finished, when his voice cracked on the last word and he looked away so I wouldn't see him cry, I told him he still had a job. I kept him on, paid his salary during her treatment leave, and told no one, not the investors, not the board, not even my co-founder. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't optics. It wasn't any of the things they teach you in business school. It was basic decency, the kind my father would have shown, the kind that costs nothing except maybe everything. We grew anyway. Revenue climbed past $1 million, then 3, then 8. Not overnight, not in some dramatic hockey stick curve, but steadily, reliably, like Thomas stacking boxes in the warehouse. I gave small equity slices to warehouse staff before I took a raise myself, tiny percentages that added up to maybe nothing in dollar terms, but meant everything in terms of who owned what we were building. Some board members called me naive, said I was diluting value, said employees should be grateful for a paycheck and nothing more. I called it alignment. I called it building something worth building. And maybe they were right about the short term, maybe I left money on the table. But when I walked through that warehouse at night and saw people still there, still working, still caring because they owned a piece of it too, I knew I'd made the right call. You can't buy that kind of commitment. You can't fake it. You can only earn it slowly, day by day, by showing up and doing the right thing when no one's watching. As we scaled, the board changed. New chairman, sharper suits, sharper language, a man named Harrison who'd made his fortune in private equity and spoke in acronyms I had to look up. He told me privately one evening, after a meeting where I'd pushed back on a cost-cutting measure that would have laid off 12 warehouse workers. "You built this, Caleb, and nobody can take that away from you. But building and running are different skills. You understand that, right? I smiled, nodded, said all the right things, but something cold settled in my stomach, something that felt like the first hint of winter when you're not ready for it. I'd heard that tone before, from investors who saw people as line items, from consultants who never met payroll, from people who thought culture was something you could buy on a retreat. I ignored it. I told myself I was being paranoid. I kept building, kept showing up, kept doing what I'd always done, while somewhere above me the ground was shifting in ways I couldn't see. Thomas thanked me one evening while we were locking up. His wife was in remission, the treatments had worked, against all odds, against every prognosis, and he stood by the loading dock in the fading light, looking older than when he'd arrived but somehow steadier too. He said, "Character compounds, son. Most people don't understand that until it's too late. You do one small right thing, then another, and eventually you look around and realize you're standing on something solid while everyone else is sinking." I didn't realize until later that he was saying goodbye. Not in the dramatic sense, not with tears or speeches, but quietly, like a man who's finished what he came to do. I shook his hand, promised to visit, told him to take care of himself, and watched him walk out into the parking lot under the flickering lights, his shadow stretching long across the asphalt until he reached his truck and drove away. A few weeks later, Thomas resigned quietly. The official letter cited personal reasons, desire to simplify, focus on family, all the standard language that means nothing and everything. His wife was stable, he wrote, and he wanted to spend whatever time they had left without the weight of schedules and responsibilities. I called him, left messages, offered to adjust his role, do whatever it took to keep him, but he never called back. I shook his hand in the parking lot that last time, under those same flickering lights, and told him the door was always open. He smiled, that quiet smile that never gave away more than he wanted it to, and said, "I know, Caleb. That's why I came." I watched his taillights disappear onto the main road and went back inside to the warehouse that felt emptier somehow, not knowing that chapter of my life was about to close too. Then the board meeting happened, the vote, the removal, the clean corporate language that felt like a blade wrapped in velvet. They said it was about scaling, about optics, about maximizing shareholder value. They said my leadership style, while effective in the early stages, wasn't appropriate for a company of our size. They said all the things people say when they're taking something from you and want to feel good about it. Harrison did most of the talking, his voice smooth as glass, his eyes never quite meeting mine. The other three nodded along, faces carefully neutral, and I realized they'd been planning this for weeks, maybe months. The vote was unanimous. 4-1. I was out. And the strangest part, the part that still haunts me, is that I felt almost nothing in that moment, just a kind of numbness, a distance from myself, as if I were watching someone else's life fall apart on a screen. After I was pushed out, 2 senior engineers called me at home to say they didn't agree with what happened. Their voices were tight, angry, the way people get when they witness an injustice they can't fix. I told them not to risk their careers for me, not to say anything publicly, not to make themselves targets. Loyalty isn't something you demand, it's something you earn, and if I'd earned theirs, the last thing I wanted was for them to pay for it. They argued, both of them, said it wasn't right, said they'd walk if that's what it took. I talked them down, reminded them of their families, their mortgages, their futures. We hung up with promises to stay in touch, and I sat in my living room for a long time after, staring at the wall, wondering if I'd done the right thing or just the easy thing. Within a month, more resignations followed. Quiet, professional, no drama, just a steady trickle of people who'd been with me from the early days, people who'd taken equity instead of salary, people who'd packed boxes in that freezing warehouse. They cited personal reasons, new opportunities, desire for change. The company's statement called it natural turnover. I knew better. Meanwhile, my replacement, a polished executive named Denise who never packed a box in her life, initiated aggressive expansion plans that ignored the culture we had built. New hires who never met the warehouse staff. New policies that prioritized speed over quality. New metrics that measured everything that mattered nothing. I watched from a distance, helpless, as something I'd built with my own hands was slowly dismantled by people who never held a folding table steady. Then I received a heavy cream envelope, the kind that costs more than a stamp, with my name handwritten in ink that caught the light. Inside, a cardstock invitation to dinner at a private club downtown, the kind of place I'd walked past 100 times but never entered. The initials at the bottom read TB. And below them, in the same careful hand, a single sentence. Character compounds, son. Let's talk. I hadn't seen Thomas since the parking lot handshake, hadn't heard his voice in months, and here he was, inviting me to a club I couldn't afford to join, signing his name like we were old friends. I stared at the card for a long time, turning it over in my hands, wondering who Thomas Brennan really was and why he'd waited until now to reach out. When I walked into that dining room, all dark wood and white tablecloths and waiters who appeared silently at your elbow, Thomas wasn't dressed like a warehouse worker. He wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than my first car, and he sat beside two seasoned investors I recognized from industry conferences, men whose names appeared on lists of the wealthiest people in the state. I stopped in the doorway, suddenly aware of my off-the-rack blazer and the shoes that were starting to wear at the heels. Thomas stood, crossed the room, and took my hand in both of his, the same steady grip I remembered from the loading dock. "Caleb," he said, "thank you for coming. I owe you an explanation." And in that moment, surrounded by wealth I'd never touched and people I'd only read about, I realized I had never truly known the full story of the man I defended. Over dinner, filet mignon I couldn't taste, wine I couldn't name. Thomas calmly explained that years earlier, long before he applied for that operations job, he had quietly invested a small amount through a blind trust. Not for control, he said, not for profit, but to observe leadership up close. He wanted to see who I was when money was tight, when things went wrong, when no one was watching. The warehouse job was research, a way to test whether my values were real or just branding, whether I'd fold under pressure or hold steady. He'd done it before, he said, with other founders, other companies, always looking for the same thing, someone who'd do the right thing when it cost them something. He told me he never needed the warehouse paycheck. His portfolio could have bought the company outright, several times over. But he needed to know, needed to see with his own eyes, whether I was the real thing or just another founder who talked a good game until the pressure hit. Covering his wife's medical leave had answered that question more clearly than any pitch deck ever could. He'd watched me absorb a $40,000 loss without flinching, without blaming him, without even telling anyone why I was doing it. He'd watched me sit with him on those pallets and listen. And in that moment, he said, he knew I was the kind of person worth betting on. He revealed that he had voted against my removal. His blind trust had accumulated enough shares to give him a seat at that table, but had been outnumbered by Harrison and the others. However, he hadn't been idle. In the weeks following the vote, he had quietly begun backing several of our engineers in a new venture, a company structured around long-term employee ownership, designed from the ground up to protect against exactly what had happened to me. They weren't leaving out of rebellion, he said. They were leaving because they believed culture mattered more than valuation, because they'd seen what happened when growth became the only goal. Thomas slid a folder across the table, thick with documents, outlining a new company, lean, ethical, employee-owned, and asked me to lead it. Starting over felt humiliating at first. Folding tables again, different church, same scratches. Borrowed office space above a bakery that smelled like bread at 6 a.m. and cinnamon all day. Second-hand chairs with stains no one asked about. I was 42 years old, had built and lost an 8-figure company, and here I was back where I started, eating lunch at my desk because we couldn't afford a break room. But something was different this time. Every person there had chosen to be there, not for stock hype or quick riches, but for trust. They'd walked away from stable jobs, from titles and salaries, because they believed in something I couldn't quite name. And sitting in that borrowed space, surrounded by people who'd chosen me, I realized that starting over wasn't humiliation, it was redemption. Clients began reaching out quietly, their voices low on the phone, asking about capacity and timelines and whether we could handle their business. They were frustrated with the aggressive cost-cutting at my former company, with response times that had slipped from hours to days, with turnover so visible that service quality had become a running joke in the industry. One by one, they switched. Not because we were cheaper, we weren't, but because we answered the phone, because we knew their names, because we treated their business like it mattered. Within 18 months, we had recovered most of the clients I'd originally built, plus new ones who'd heard the story and wanted to work with people who actually gave a damn. Within a year, our new company reached $8 million in valuation, slower growth than before, steadier, built on relationships instead of metrics. I thought that might be the victory, the proof that integrity had won, that you could do things right and still succeed. I was proud of what we'd built, proud of the team, proud of the culture we'd protected. But Thomas, who'd become a kind of shadow advisor, a presence in the background, kept telling me the story wasn't over. Character compounds, he'd say, that same phrase, and I'd nod without really understanding what he meant. I thought I'd already seen the compounding. I had no idea what was coming. Then Thomas collapsed at the office one afternoon. One moment he was standing by the coffee machine, making some dry observation about the weather. The next, he was on the floor, his face gray, his breath shallow. We rushed him to the hospital, rode in the ambulance with sirens cutting through traffic, sat in the waiting room while doctors did things we couldn't see. Sitting beside his bed that evening, machines beeping softly in the background, he admitted his health had been failing for months. The cancer they thought was gone had returned, spread further, and he'd known since before the dinner at the private club. That urgency, not ambition, had accelerated everything. He'd been racing against time, building something that would outlast him, and he hadn't told anyone because he didn't want pity or special treatment. He handed me legal documents from the bedside table, his hands shaking slightly, the papers rustling with the weight of what they contained. They transferred the majority of his shares, not to me, not to his family, but to an employee trust that permanently guaranteed ownership for the workforce. Every person who worked for us, from the most senior engineer to the newest hire in the warehouse, would hold equity. Not options that might expire, not grants that could be diluted, but real, permanent ownership in the company they were building. He said leadership should be stewardship, not possession, that companies should outlast the people who founded them, that the only legacy worth leaving was one that couldn't be taken away. Around the same time, my old company announced a rush acquisition that saddled them with debt. Harrison had pushed it through despite warnings from the remaining staff, desperate to hit growth targets that didn't matter. Layoffs followed, first the warehouse workers, then the customer service team, then the engineers who'd stayed because they needed the paycheck. People I once hired, people I'd trained, people I'd celebrated pizza with in a freezing warehouse, were suddenly unemployed because growth had been prioritized over stability. I watched the news with a sick feeling in my stomach, knowing I could have prevented it, knowing I'd been pushed out precisely because I would have prevented it. Several former board members contacted me discreetly when bankruptcy loomed. Their voices were different now. Softer, humbler, stripped of the confidence they'd worn like armor. They asked whether our new firm would consider acquiring the assets, preserving whatever jobs could be saved, keeping the company from being sold off in pieces to vulture funds. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same people who'd voted to remove me were now begging for my help, and I could have said no. I could have let them fail, let them learn the hard way what happens when you prioritize optics over people. But that's not who I was. That's not who Thomas had taught me to be. I walked back into the same glass building I had been escorted out of, the turnstile that had blinked red now blinking green as my new badge cleared. The security guard, the same one who wouldn't meet my eyes that day, stood a little straighter when I passed, and I nodded at him like nothing had happened. This time I wasn't there to reclaim ego, wasn't there to prove a point or savor revenge. I was there to protect employees from the fallout of decisions they never made, to save jobs that shouldn't have been at risk, to do exactly what Thomas had done for me, show up when it mattered. In that same boardroom, with the same glass table and the same logo on the wall, I announced the acquisition and explained the employee ownership structure Thomas had created. Warehouse workers, engineers, administrators, custodial staff, everyone would hold equity. Not as a reward for loyalty, not as a gesture of goodwill, but as a fundamental restructuring of who owned what we built. The current executives sat silently, their faces unreadable, while I laid out terms that gave them nothing and gave everyone else everything. The security guard who once watched me leave, the one who'd stood by while my badge was deactivated, shook my hand in the hallway afterward with tears in his eyes. His name was Marcus. He'd been there 8 years. He'd never owned anything in his life. Thomas passed later that year, quietly, in the hospital where his wife had been treated, with her hand in his and the afternoon light falling across the bed. I was there, along with a dozen others whose lives he'd touched, and we sat in that room long after he stopped breathing, not wanting to leave, not knowing how to say goodbye to someone who'd given us everything and asked for nothing. At the memorial service, people spoke for hours. Employees, investors, strangers whose stories we'd never heard, and every single one said the same thing. He saw something in them they didn't see in themselves, and he stayed until they believed it too. We placed a framed photo of Thomas at the head of the conference table after he passed, a simple black and white shot of him standing in the warehouse, hands in his pockets, smiling that quiet smile. I told the entire staff, gathered in that room and spilling into a hallway, that I didn't get my company back. I got something better, a company built to outlast ego, to outlast any single person, to survive whatever came next. They voted me out once, but they couldn't vote out integrity. They could remove me from the building, but they couldn't remove what I'd built with Thomas and everyone else who believed that business could be different. Character compounds, slowly, invisibly, day by day. And when it does, it changes everything. I know because I've seen it. I've lived it. And every morning when I walk through that lobby, past the turnstile that lets me in, past Marcus with his steady nod, past the photo of a man who taught me what matters, I know that my father was right. Build it so you can sleep at night. Everything else is just details.